is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
U.S. President Donald Trump pardons dozens of his aides and supporters with just a few hours left in his term. U.S. President-elect Joe Biden to be inaugurated today. What can Africa expect from his presidency? And Nigeria worried about fake coronavirus vaccines, even as exhausted medics wait for vaccine relief. Hello and thank you for joining us on Africa Live. I am Peninah Karibe. Also coming up this hour, economic and social fallout from the coronavirus pandemic remain top global threats according to the World Economic Forum. And in sports, DR Congo looking to extend Group B lead after successful first-round matches. With hours left in his term, the U.S. President Donald Trump is pardoning dozens of his aides and supporters. Former chief strategist Steve Bannon is among the latest to get clemency. Bannon was a key advisor during Trump's 2016 presidential run. He was charged last year with fraud but had yet to stand trial. Trump also pardoned Elliot Brady, a former Republican fundraiser who pled guilty last year to conspiring to violate foreign lobbying laws. So far, more than 100 people have been pardoned by Trump as he prepares to leave the White House. Security is high in the U.S. Capitol ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration in a few hours. Thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed to Washington over concerns of more violence from supporters of the outgoing president. Donald Trump. Giles Gibson reports.
2 weeks to the day after a mob of Trump supporters took control of the U.S. Capitol, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th President of the United States on the same marble steps they swarmed over. National Guard troops with assault rifles have replaced Trump supporters with MAGA flags on Washington's streets. At the same time, authorities have been scrambling to work out how the Capitol's dedicated police force was completely overwhelmed on the 6th of January.
The Capitol Police were really put in several ways in an unwinnable situation. The Capitol Police, like the Secret Service, are a very small agency. The last numbers I saw, the Capitol Police had about 2,500 people total.
According to a leaked intelligence report, the Capitol Police warned Congress itself could be a target that day, but that same report doesn't appear to have been shared widely with other agencies like the FBI. Meanwhile, the Capitol Police chief, who's now resigned, says he didn't receive any warnings from the FBI about a potential attack.
The city has already had to deal with the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and heightened security last summer after looters took advantage of peaceful protests over the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. And now the city centre is being protected by thousands of National Guard troops.
It all adds up to a city on edge as it counts down to Biden's inauguration on Wednesday. But the Secret Service is known for expecting the unexpected.
Whether it's a drone, whether it's a car bomb, whether it's a lone gunman with a handgun from 100 yards away, preparation and practice has been done to thwart that already.
Unlike 4 years ago, there won't be any arguments about the size of the crowd, with Biden supporters kept away from the National Mall due to fears over security and the coronavirus pandemic. Even so, the new president is expected to lay out his vision of America united from ground zero of what he described as one of the darkest days in U.S. history. Giles Gibson for CGTN in Washington.
Joe Biden will take over a country bitterly divided. He's promised some big changes immediately after he takes office. But will he be able to deliver? CGTN's Brian Dorman has more on some of the challenges awaiting the incoming president.
The honest truth is this: things will get worse before they get better. Policy changes that we're going to be making are going to take time.
At 78 years old, Joe Biden is re-entering the political scene during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. But has his time as a U.S. Senator or tenure as Vice President under Barack Obama prepared him for this? an ongoing pandemic that's left hundreds of thousands of Americans dead and millions sick. This as the U.S. healthcare system struggles to keep pace. The national economy nearly in ruins, businesses going bust, and millions out of work. Frayed relations with allies, increased tension with adversaries, unresolved social upheaval, and an accelerating climate crisis, experts say, warrants calls for a national emergency. Observers say nothing less than a radical reorientation towards all these crises will bring the U.S. back from the brink. But Joe Biden has ambitious plans to curb the coronavirus pandemic and speed up the vaccine rollout, to reform immigration, to address climate change, and revitalize the economy, starting with a massive $1.9 trillion relief package.
In this moment of crisis, with interest rates at historic lows, we cannot afford inaction. Critical foreign policy.
Whether or not the Biden administration will get as much done as they hope to is an open question. Will Republicans, a divided party in convulsions over Trump, coalesce to obstruct Biden's plans? Will Biden's agenda be progressive enough for Democrats, many of whom say policies that Biden opposes, such as the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, are necessary to meet the challenges ahead? Whatever comes, the next 4 years aren't predicted to go easily for the 46th president, as the battle for the soul of the nation is only just beginning. Brian Dorman, CGTN.
The world, and indeed Africa, is waiting to see what the new administration in the U.S. will bring. Let's get some more insights from Professor Chris Isike, Professor of African Politics and Development at the University of Pretoria, and he joins us via Zoom from Pretoria. Professor Isike, for the last 4 years, Africa's relationship with the U.S. has not been the greatest. I mean, we've had President Donald Trump insult African countries. He introduced travel bans and immigration policies that disproportionately affected African students, and he favored doing business with individual countries as opposed to a more multilateral orientation. So looking back, how did all of these policies affect the continent?
Well, good day to you, and thanks for having me. Indeed, President Trump had a very Africa-averse administration, and ideally this should have served as a reality check on the continent and its leaders, especially to get their acts right, but it did not. Instead, Trump's isolation of Africa may have actually helped to embolden dictators, especially given his assault on U.S. democracy and multilateralism globally. So, for instance, we see how democracy has recently been assaulted in a country like Uganda, and when the president of Uganda, Museveni, referenced the U.S. and its democratic systems in many ways. Well, so I'm hoping that President-elect Biden's election, helps to restore confidence in democracy and democratic processes, especially at a time when the African continent is currently, undergoing political shifts as well.
Right. And just to pick up from where you've left, of course, Joe Biden is being inaugurated today as the 46th president of the United States. You did talk about your hope, talking about democracy for the continent, but what more can Africa expect from his administration?
Well, let me say that every U.S. administration acts in line with the country's national interest. And although a president does have some leverage in influencing, U.S. foreign policy in particular directions based on their personal idiosyncrasies, as we saw with Donald Trump, the core national, interest focus of American foreign policy always remains the same. So this is in part because of the institutionalized nature of its foreign policy. So therefore, Africa should not really expect too much in terms of what it can benefit, okay? However, we can expect to see a few shifts, from Trump's foreign policy posture towards the continent, which will have different implications for us. So, for example, Joe Biden is very likely to renew the African Growth and Opportunity Act when it expires. This is something Trump has signaled he was not going to be renewing. Countries such as South Africa benefit greatly from the AGOA in spite of its limitations. He's also expected to push for a big stimulus package, which will have trickle-down effects on Africa, given that China will benefit and China will come down to look onto the continent for, raw materials. President Biden is also poised to restore the spirit of multilateralism and upholding democratic values and human rights in its relations with Africa. The triumph of democracy and Biden's seeming resolve to address systemic racism in the U.S. will affect how he relates with the continent and how African leaders will behave as well. So these are some of the things that one can expect to see from a Biden foreign policy posture, which is less averse to the continent.
Well, there is some sentiment from the continent that most U.S. administrations appoint individuals who recycle the same old thinking about Africa. Is the continent doing enough to change the way the U.S. engages with Africa?
Well, to start with, if Africa wants the way the world sees and engages with it to change, Africa must first reinvent itself. Then the world will be forced to see it differently and engage with it as such. Africa needs to do more. So to answer your question directly, Africa is not doing enough. It needs to do more, than sit back and expect the US in this instance, to change its perception of the continent. As I said just now, the US acts in its national interest always, irrespective of which administration or party is in power at any particular point in time. So Africa must look at itself and define its own interests first as individual states, then as a region, and then act in line with these interests. And the world, including the US, would have little choice but to engage with it on its own terms. So, for example, the Continental Free Trade Agreement presents a good opportunity for the continent to act in its own interest by trading within itself and setting the terms of the trade with the rest of the world, including the US and China, as the case may be.
All right, Professor Christy Sike, thank you very much for your time. Now, Donald Trump's presidency has been a roller coaster ride of ups and downs, controversies and victories. CGTN's Timothy Ulrich takes a look at the legacy he'll be leaving behind.
Trump's White House has faced challenges from day one. The pandemic, the economic fallout, and violent protests, just to name a few. His culpability in these crises will be what historians study for generations to come. One example of this is the rise of right-wing violence. Just over a year into his term, far-right groups clashed with counter-protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other far-right groups converged on the city in August 2017. Many wore red Trump hats, showing their support for the president. His initial response to the violence was to blame everyone equally.
You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent.
That caused a major backlash from the public and media, and he later issued a stronger response. Critics also blame the president and his rhetoric for emboldening groups like white supremacists. President Trump's last year in office saw another surge in violent protests. The killing of George Floyd, a black man, by Minneapolis police sparked demonstrations across the country. There were weeks of violence, ebbing and flowing with new instances of police killings. There are some challenges that arose during Trump's term that would be difficult no matter who was in the White House. The coronavirus outbreak, to name one. Infections and deaths soared in his final year. The healthcare system was stretched to its limits, and unemployment rates reached record highs. Months into the pandemic, veteran White House journalist Bob Woodward revealed Trump knew the dangers of the coronavirus early on. Woodward released audio from a call he had with Trump in February.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
President Trump defended the call by saying he wanted to keep the economy afloat. Foreign policy was where the Trump administration claimed many victories. These include becoming the first U.S. president to step into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. While his meetings with DPRK leader Kim Jong-un may have not amounted to much on paper, it helped turn the page on relations between Washington and Pyongyang. But his foreign policy wasn't all wins. Trump pulled out of the Climate Paris Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and the World Health Organization in his term. He also started a trade war with China, putting a major strain on ties with Beijing. And President Trump brought the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran at the start of 2020. He ordered the killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani. The assassination infuriated the Islamic Republic, with Tehran vowing retaliation. The Trump administration faced its fair share of challenges, and the effects of his decisions are likely to be felt for a long time. In the very least, a legacy of its own of what a single-term president was able to achieve. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
As Nigeria prepares to receive its first batch of COVID-19 vaccines later this month, it has one more thing to worry about: fake vaccines. The country's national drug regulator says fake COVID-19 vaccines may be in circulation in the country. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmas with more on that story.
It's certainly not the kind of news health authorities in the country need at a time when they are trying to dispel conspiracy theories about COVID-19 vaccines and get people prepared to receive them when mass inoculation begins. But the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, NAFDAC, says people should be on the lookout for fake vaccines.
NAFDAC is pleading with the public to be aware. No COVID vaccines have been approved by NAFDAC. Fake vaccines can cause COVID-like illnesses or other serious diseases that could kill. Please be aware, COVID vaccines should not be ordered by any company or corporation. The companies that manufacture these vaccines, if they are genuine companies, know they have to submit their applications to NAFDAC for review.
Medical experts warn that if urgent steps are not taken to address the problem, the country might be plunged into another public health crisis.
We have to open up our eagle eyes at this time so that we can, apprehend some of these people that are moving around peddling the fake COVID-19 vaccine. That is on the regulatory angle. On the supply angle, we must be able to make adequate plans to ensure that all Nigerians have access to the vaccine. Because without that, I can assure you that more and more people will fall a victim and fall prey to this fake vaccine.
Among COVID-19 vaccine skeptics, the situation has further increased their doubts.
If really it exists, the fear is that there is not enough awareness for people to differentiate between the original and the fake one. That's to say, there is going to be a lot of tragedy with regards to that.
I'm not even seen the original vaccine, so why would I be afraid of taking the fake one? It is a situation where they say there is an original motto, and they say the fake version of the motto is coming out. I have not seen the original. Up to now, NAFDAC have never come out to show us that we have a vaccine for it.
Nigeria plans to vaccinate at least 70% of its population over the next 2 years in order to stop the transmission of COVID-19 in the country. It's expecting around 100,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine in the coming weeks. About 42 million doses of other COVID-19 vaccines are expected to come in by early March. The government says the country's scientists are also working to come up with a homegrown solution. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Even as they worry about fake jabs, Nigerian doctors have expressed anxiety about the arrival of a coronavirus vaccine. Nigeria has recorded a spike in the number of COVID-19 infections following the discovery of a new virus variant. CGTN's Joy Kirukijuma reports.
Medics at Abuja's EHA clinic in Nigeria are exhausted. Long lines of coronavirus patients await them. News of a vaccine is also top on their mind. Several European countries have been inoculating their populations since December. Health authorities in Africa say it could be weeks, even months, before they get their first jobs. Dr. Oluwajoba Oroge says new cases are mounting daily, putting a strain on all resources.
STEM things, a vaccine to even produce to give us some herd immunity. So that continues to mean more work stress, more mental stress, more stress on all the resources that I as an individual and the facility has to offer.
It is not only patients' lives at risk. Over 2,600 Nigerian doctors have contracted COVID-19. Dozens of them have died.
We have depleting numbers, even before this COVID-19 pandemic, through brain drain. And even during this pandemic, a lot of doctors have left the shores of this country. So we are depleted every day by the minute. And yet we are combating a lot of cases, as you see that, as it is now that the cases are rising.
African states have accused richer nations of hoarding most of the vaccine supplies. On Monday, World Health Organization head Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said the world was on the brink of catastrophic moral failure when it came to sharing out shots. Medics now hope that once the vaccines arrive, they will be shared out equitably. Joy Kirukijuma, CGTN.
You're watching Africa Live. We're taking a quick break. When we come back, rescuers working to free 22 gold miners trapped underground for 10 days in eastern China. And a look at how the Ethiopian government is handling the humanitarian situation in Tigray region.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Syria,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Rescuers are still working to free 22 gold miners who have been trapped underground for 10 days in eastern China. Crews have made contact with a dozen of the workers, luring them food and medical supplies. It's unclear the fate of the other 10. Our reporter Huang Yue has more from the site in Shandong province.
Last night, the doctors on the site learned from the telephone conversation with the trapped miners underground that one of the 11 people has been in a coma due to the severe head injuries in the explosion, and 2 are now experiencing mild discomfort. 8 of them are in stable conditions. The miners also said that the one person in the tunnel lower than theirs has also got some injuries, but they're not clear about his situation in detail. You know, there are only 2 ways to lift the miners up to the ground. One is through the return air shaft. You can understand it simply as the entrance of the mine, but you know, since the explosion, a large amount of debris has stuck in the shaft, and the clearance has been one of the most difficult things in the rescue operation. And the second way is to lift them through a larger drill hole. So you can take a look at the picture here. I've got this picture. There are now a total of 10 drill holes on the site. The number 9 and number 10 were newly added yesterday. So now, as you can see, the number 1 and number 3 drill hole, they have already reached the tunnels where miners are trapped. And actually, rescuers are using number 3 drill hole to deliver supplies and keep contact with the miners where at a depth of about 586 meters. And number 7 and number 8, these 2 holes will be used to pump groundwater.
Now, some news just in. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has announced the death of Sibusiso Moyo, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. Mnangagwa said the late minister died from COVID-19 at a local hospital in Zimbabwe. He passed away early this morning at the age of 61. Moyo previously served in the Zimbabwean National Army. He was a Major General before being promoted to Lieutenant General on retirement in 2017. Meanwhile, a rapid surge in COVID-19 infections in Zimbabwe has more patients needing oxygen therapy. However, medical oxygen is in short supply at some health facilities in the country. CGTN's Farim Wakutuya brings us more details from Harare.
Zimbabwe's second wave is spreading across the country with greater ferocity than the first.
Since the beginning of the year, 8 out of 10 patients that have been treated at this clinic have been COVID-19 cases. Between 30 to 40% of those have been in respiratory distress, which requires oxygen for treatment.
The first phase had quite few people progressing with the symptoms to need ventilation or to need oxygen. But all of a sudden, the second attack comes heavily. And with so many people now requiring oxygen, it means pressure becomes quite high on oxygen. So the demand becomes very much quite high, and you find a lot of people looking for hospitals to be admitted in order to get some oxygen. So we find some people actually trying to purchase oxygen from their homes. You find the people trying to look for tanks, oxygen, to do oxygen therapy at homes.
According to Marisa, the leading gas supplier has had to cut other product lines in order to increase their production of medical oxygen.
We have our main company, BOC, which has increased its production capacity to beyond 70 tons per day of oxygen, and from 50, which means there's a 40% increase in demand for oxygen. They've actually stopped the production of industrial oxygen that is used for welding and so forth, because the life comes first.
Zimbabwe has reverted to hard lockdown restrictions until February. Intercity movement is banned, an overnight curfew has been extended, and gatherings are capped at 30 people as the country desperately tries to halt the resurgent spread.
We are a little resourced countries in Africa, and our major aim is to be on prevention more than on treatment. We do not have enough capacity for treatment, but we can do something on prevention. We don't want to fail on both.
The government says it has released about $86 million to recruit more health workers, procure medicines and personal protective equipment, and increase capacity at hospitals to admit more patients. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
It has been over 2 months since the conflict began in Ethiopia's Tigray region. Some reports suggest more than 4.5 million people, nearly the region's entire population, need emergency food aid. But how is the government handling the humanitarian situation in Tigray? Here's CGTN's Grimchala with that story.
Many aid organizations, including those which belong to the UN, said there is an urgent need for food assistance in Tigray regional state. The Ethiopian government said it is delivering assistance to the most vulnerable daily. The country's agency for refugees and returnees says it's also working to bring back citizens in Sudanese camps.
We are working day and night to ensure their safe return to their home. We have been able to expedite an operation that ensures the safe travel back to Ethiopia. Basically, some of the refugees are returning by themselves without any support and without any assistance. The most important thing that they want is assurance from the Ethiopian government that the region is safe.
It is not only the Tigray region's local population who need aid. It's also Eritrean refugees in different camps in the region.
There are around 100,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray. 46,000 of these reside in 4 campuses that are located in the Tigray region, and the rest 46,000 reside in out-of-camp policy, which means they are scattered throughout the cities of Tigray and Ethiopia as well. So we have assessed the situation in what is going on with the 4 camps in Tigray and the major cities, especially Shire and other neighboring cities, and we have started distributing food.
Still, aid agencies call for more robust measures to be taken by authorities to avoid any future humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray. These include the opening of more safe humanitarian corridors and allow better access for aid agencies to operate in. Grumtara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Madagascar's latest agricultural season has been devastated by its worst drought in decades. Combined with the COVID-19 pandemic, 3 consecutive droughts have left over 1.2 million people in the Grand Sud area in need of humanitarian aid. The United Nations is appealing for $76 million to support people in urgent need of food, water and sanitation and health assistance.
We are trying to be out there urgently right now to save lives which are at risk. One of the things that are particularly concerning is, of course, that the normal coping mechanisms for people during the lean season, because this is not the first time that we have food insecurity in Madagascar, is often to send a family member to the larger cities to look for work so that they can send money back home. With COVID-19, this kind of coping mechanism is no longer available. 1 in 3 people in the south are now severely food insecure. The food security analysis from last month, so December, also showed the alarming projection of more than 135,000 children under the age of 5 suffering from acute malnutrition in the coming months in the Grand Sud.
A reminder of some of our top stories at this hour. With hours left in his term, the U.S. President Donald Trump is pardoning dozens of his aides and supporters. Former chief strategist Steve Bannon is among the latest to get clemency. Bannon was a key advisor during Trump's 2016 presidential run. He was charged last year with fraud but had yet to stand trial. Trump also pardoned Elliot Brody, a former Republican fundraiser who pleaded guilty last year to conspiring to violate foreign lobbying laws. So far, more than 100 people have been pardoned by Trump as he prepares to leave the White House. Nigerian authorities are worried about possible fake COVID-19 vaccines in circulation in the country. Nigeria's drug regulator raised the alarm as the nation awaits authentic vaccines expected to arrive later this month. And rescuers in eastern China are still working to free 22 gold miners who have been trapped underground for 10 days. Crews have made contact with a dozen of the workers, luring them food and medical supplies. The fate of the other 10 is still unknown. That's a look at some of the day's top stories. Coming up in business news. Economic and social fallout from the coronavirus pandemic remain top global threats according to the World Economic Forum. And South Sudan and Sudan agree to increase oil production to generate more revenue.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Economic and social fallout from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic are among the top global threats. That's according to the latest report by the World Economic Forum. The 16th Global Risk Report found mass unemployment, digital inequality and prolonged economic stagnation were some of the risks that could pose a danger in the next 2 years. It noted that young adults are experiencing their second major global crisis in a decade, having lived through the disruption of the financial crisis and the economic inequality it sparked. Climate change remained among the top long-term concerns. The report is based on a survey of over 800 people, part of the World Economic Forum stakeholder communities, including business, academia, government and NGOs. Earlier, CGTN's Juliet Mann talked with Saadia Zahidi, the managing director of the World Economic Forum, on more of the Global Risk Report. Take a listen.
Thanks ever so much for joining us. So we're talking about COVID amplifying those social and those economic issues. But what does your risk report tell us that we didn't already know?
I think what's happened with the pandemic is that the social fractures that already existed, the economic inequality that already existed, that has been supercharged. At the same time, the fourth industrial revolution and the use of digital technologies has also accelerated. And so you're starting to see this perfect storm where not only is there a health crisis, but you're starting to see some of that social cohesion disappearing. You're starting to see many more fractures, much more inequality than before. And that then will be an impediment to the other big issue that we have to deal with globally. As you mentioned, the big existential risk in 5 to 10 years out is still climate change. And if we don't have the social cohesion that leads to global cooperation, that's not a challenge that we're going to be able to address. So I think what the report does is heighten the sense of urgency and tell us how much faster some of these things, some of these challenges are coming.
You mentioned that big existential crisis in the longer term, but what about the medium term? What are the knock-on effects of those risks going to be?
So on the one hand, it was absolutely critical that governments do the kind of spending they have done to provide short-term support to economies, to ensure that households are supported, to ensure that as many jobs as possible are being preserved. And at the same time, that may create in the long term the possible risk of debt crisis. So that's the kind of knock-on effect that we can see may come in a few years' time. This doesn't mean that this is a prediction. What this is trying to raise the concern about some of the risks. Now, if governments do put in place the right kinds of investments, they ensure that this is not just about the shorter term emergency measures, but some of the right investments are being put in place to recreate the kind of inclusive and sustainable growth we need, then we should be able to mitigate the effects of some of these potential future risks.
Janet Yellen, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's nominee for Treasury Secretary, has urged lawmakers to act big on coronavirus relief spending. Yellen warned the economic benefits far outweigh the risks of a higher debt burden. The 74-year-old spoke to a Senate Finance Committee in her nomination hearing on Tuesday. She said her task as Treasury Chief would be to help Americans endure the final months of the pandemic as the population is vaccinated. She also stressed to rebuild the economy to make it more competitive and create more prosperity and jobs. Meanwhile, Gary Gensler, a former financial regulator and Goldman Sachs group executive, is expected to be nominated to head the Securities and Exchange Commission. Some insiders say Gensler's nomination will please liberals who cheered the former regulator's tough approach to rulemaking during the Obama administration. U.S. President Donald Trump pulled out of a number of global deals while in office, instead favoring a unilateralist approach. His successor, Joe Biden, on the other hand, says America's standing on the world stage has diminished and vows to play a bigger part. CGTN's William Denslow looks at the task Biden faces.
On his first day in office, Joe Biden has pledged to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord and hold a climate summit within the first 100 days of his presidency. This marks a stark departure from his predecessor Donald Trump, who pulled the US out of the 2015 agreement on grounds that it put America at a disadvantage in global trade. President Trump's preference for unilateralism over multilateralism has played out frequently at the United Nations over the past several years. The Trump administration has pulled out of several UN agencies, including the World Health Organization and UNESCO. Joe Biden has vowed to rejoin the WHO and for the US to once again play a leading role in global diplomacy. As vice president in the Obama administration, the US negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade deal between the US and 11 other nations that would have covered roughly 40% of the global economy. But Congress didn't sign off on it, and President Trump pulled out of the agreement in 2017. Analysts believe a Biden administration might struggle getting lawmakers to agree rejoining the TPP. It remains unclear how the Biden administration's approach to trade will differ from that of his predecessor. But it's likely decisions will be made more in concert with US allies, a marked change from President Trump's tendency to go it alone. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South Sudan and Sudan have agreed to increase oil production in a move aimed at generating more revenues for the two neighboring nations. Oil produced in South Sudan is transported by pipelines to Port Sudan. It's then shipped onwards with the oil revenue shared between the two countries. CGTN's Patrick Oyet reports.
Oil money funds more than 98% of South Sudan's government budget. However, oil production and revenue have fallen since 2013. Civil war from 2013 to 2018 destroyed some oil facilities. Petroleum production plummeted from around about 320,000 barrels a day to the current 180,000 barrels a day, according to the Petroleum Ministry. An increase in production will mean more use of oil infrastructure in Sudan, which requires cooperation from Khartoum.
We have agreed that Sudan will have a coordination office in Juba. The ministry will have a coordination office in Juba. We have a coordination office here in Khartoum, and we will also have in Port Sudan, where we receive our goods most of the time. This coordination office are meant to ease communication between the two countries, between the two ministries, and is also meant to ease the operation in the oil fields.
Sudan's new government is still experiencing communal violence in parts of the country. Extra security measures have been put in place. Juba says some of those security measures delay the arrival of vital supplies required in the oil fields. Khartoum is promising to address the situation.
We have directed our taxation officials, security operatives and state governments to prioritise clearing of goods meant for oil fields. This is one way to ensure we increase production.
Investors in South Sudan's oil sector include national oil companies from Malaysia, India and China. Some experts warn that increasing oil production without transparency and accountability in the sector will not benefit many South Sudanese people, but the government insists it wants to increase production, generate more revenue, then invest in infrastructure such as roads and develop the country's agriculture sector. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Still on oil matters, South African refineries owned by Glencore and Petroleum Nasional that make up 43% of the nation's oil refining capacity are expected to remain closed until at least 2022. That's according to energy consultancy CITAC. CGTN's Angelo Coppola has more.
The reasons the refineries remain closed and aren't being upgraded is that there's no policy certainty about the benefits, incentives and cost recoveries for the potential international investors in the new technology. South Africa has also missed the opportunity to build its own refineries due to budget constraints and an underperforming economy.
These international companies can provide the wherewithal to do that, the expertise, they've got the technology transfer ability, they have the experience in doing that. So to my mind, those are the people you want to look after. You don't want to be going into building new refineries. Typically, those take so long, and there are so many decision points along the way that generally may not have been anticipated.
Meanwhile, the offshore finds by Total and its partners have created a lot of optimism and confidence in the future of the local oil industry, specifically in the Mossel Bay area and the small government-owned refinery there. But there is a problem.
Perhaps there's an acceleration program, perhaps there's a workaround there. Perhaps they could import in the interim into that refinery. But again, I think PetroSA would want certainty into the future that there is an attractive deal from their side of the Total fund. And again, this comes down to, even though that is the national oil company, it comes down to policy certainty again.
The challenge facing the South African refineries is that they are old and need to be refurbished or replaced.
They typically were built during the 60s. And while they do function very, very well, and they've got some excellent technical people, the simple fact is that they won't be able to produce Euro 5 fuels without significant upgrades. That fuel exists on the sea.
Discussions between local and international investors and government ministers have been underway for several years now, with little or no progress being reported.
These discussions always go on and on. And South Africa is not unique. These discussions are happening all over the place. We have the compounded urgency around old refineries, constricted economy, and masses of product available on the world markets at the moment.
All refinery investors are looking for policy certainty. If they don't have that, they're not going to invest. And that's going to leave South Africa with some serious policy decisions to make. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
You're watching Africa Live. We're taking a short break. We still have plenty more coming up, including this. French MPs vote to return stolen pre-colonial artifacts to Benin and Senegal.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Members of the French National Assembly have voted in favor of returning looted African artifacts. The decision by legislators will see a portion of pre-colonial African artifacts returned to Benin and Senegal after they were stolen more than a century ago. CGTN's Mohamed Abubakar has the details.
A majority of members of the French National Assembly voted in favor of the decision to return looted artifacts back to their countries of origin. The move will see Benin reportedly receive a throne taken in 1892 from the palace of Behanzin, the last king of Dahomey. Senegal will also receive a sword belonging to a 19th century sheikh returned to the country. The two unique items are currently guarded at the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar.
Slavery and colonization have been extremely painful elements of African history. We cannot sum up our history with these two elements. I think it's important to recover the objects that seem to be most important and symbolic to our heritage. At the same time, we must not forget other objects that are scattered around Europe, which are ambassadors of the different African cultures. Colonization was a crime against humanity. It's a crime that can be expiated, it can be forgiven, it can be punished, but it remains above all a crime against humanity.
In November 2017, the French President Emmanuel Macron promised to return African artifacts in French museums to their countries of origin. This was on either a temporary or permanent basis and within a 5-year time frame. The battle to get Europe to return thousands of items stolen from Africa during colonialism is not an easy one. But many African governments are still hopeful they will succeed in retrieving all artifacts in the near future. Mohamed Abubakar, CGTN.
And ahead in sports. DR Congo looking to extend Group B lead after success.